All right, so is it possible to buy a good downhill bike on the cheap? Hopefully you saw the video yesterday where we rode these bikes ranging from $300 up to £550. And just how good or bad are these bikes? Is it possible to go downhilling on the cheap? Right, let's start with the bike that Blake rode, the Kona Stinky Deluxe. Arguably, it's not actually a downhill bike. So this is more of a free ride bike from this era. If you remember the Clump team, John Cowan, people like that, Paul Bascocia. Who else? A load of those guys are riding these bikes. So it's kind of not exactly a downhill bike. The Kona bike was a stab from that era, if I remember correctly, mid 2000s, but it's a big bike. It's got about 7 inches of travel, aluminium frame. This bike cost £300. So yes, the cheapest bike we bought. It came off Facebook Marketplace, which is a great place for finding the cheapest of cheap bikes. Things got changed. Well, it got new tyres on, 26-inch wheels, of course. So actually, these are new old stock Maxxis. You can actually see they're kind of perishing a little bit. Anyway, there's cracks on these. Didn't come with the chain guide, so we had to find one of those, borrow that off a different bike. But the biggest problem with this bike is it came with this Marzocchi Junior T. As you can see, it's got a Marzocchi Monster T up front. Big one, that's Blake's own that he had stashed at home from his old days. But the problem was this Junior T, the bottom of this sort of axle clamp has snapped. So that, well, it's completely broken. You couldn't ride that. So that is a problem with these old downhill free ride bikes, that they've probably had a hard life. And you know, some of these, like this, is pretty well built. This isn't going to break so easily, but obviously the fork has broken. That was unrideable. If you are looking at buying one of these older, cheaper downhill bikes, I would definitely go over it with a fine-tooth comb. Because if there's cracks, these bikes did crack back in the day. I don't know about these Konas, to be fair, but downhill bikes, free ride bikes from this era, quite a lot of them, you'd find cracks underneath head tube. So definitely go over the bike. You can see it's had a bit of damage here, a bit of a dent there. There's some funny discolorization, if that's a word. That paint is peeling a bit. That's a little bit weird, but overall, it's a pretty good build on this bike. Blake actually said that it was really plush. So it's got the Fox vanilla rear shock, coil shock obviously. He said the suspension worked fine on this bike. The difference between this bike and modern obviously is there's a lot of geometry things going on, the wheel size smaller. But the main thing really is this has got a 68-degree head angle. So, you know, it's a cross-country bike sort of geometry nowadays. Modern downhill bikes are in the low 60s, so way more slack than this. And all of the bikes were all quite short and quite small. So that is kind of the bigger problem with these older bikes. And this is, like I say, it's about 2004, we think. It's got a really narrow bar, it's got a 680 bar. Obviously, you could change the finishing kit on this bike. So if you wanted to tweak it a bit, like someone's put on the Oi saddle, that's obviously been changed. You could change the bars, that's gonna help a bit. But there's no getting away from the fact it's got a 68-degree head angle. It has got a funny mix of components on this bike. So it's got a Mavic Crossride rear wheel. It's got a Mavic rim on the front. I can't remember the model of that. It's got a Hope hub. That's probably the best bit of the whole bike. Bit of a mismatch, but it works. Got a Hayes front brake and it's got a cheap Shimano rear brake. They all work. So not so bad. It's in decent-ish working order. Would I recommend this bike for £300? I think, well, it's not a £300 bike anymore because Blake had to put the fork on it. So straight away you're having to spend money on it. Could you find a fork like Blake did? I mean, it's a 1 1/8 head tube straight through. So you'd have some options, but again, if you buy it and the fork's broken, you've then got to try and find a cheap second-hand fork that isn't broken. So 300 quid, I think this bike was not the best buy, if I'm honest. To the bike that Rich rode, the Mongoose Black Diamond Single. This cost an extra 50, so £350 for this beautiful piece of Is it better than Blake's bike? I think it's worse, to be fair. It's newer, 2007-ish, this bike. Has got a couple of different adjustments there. You can go from 6.5 inch travel up to 7.5. What is that? It's a Manitou rear shock, coil shock. That's pretty good, actually, to be fair. But this bike is heavy. So Blake's bike was about £41. This is £46. Obviously, Monster T, big fork. It's just super heavy. The thing that I think is probably the worst about this bike is it's a URT design. So I remember actually Andrew Neethling rode for Mongoose World Cup downhill at about this time on this bike, and he actually did surprisingly well. I talked about it in the video. I think he got a top 10 on one of these bikes, but it's a URT. So the bottom bracket, where you're stood, is attached to the swing arm. You see where it pivots up here? So the rear suspension just isn't that good. You have got a linkage here, but you know, you're stood on that rear linkage, so it's not that good. This, in fact, actually, to give it its fair dues, it's the one bike that is fully original. So we bought this bike for £350, again from Facebook Marketplace. Didn't change a thing. Having said that, you probably would want to, because like the bar and stem are heavy. It's got these skeletal brakes, is that what they're called? Yeah, I've never heard of those. Probably need to Google those, never heard of those. Rich didn't love riding this bike, it's fair to say. It's 1 degree slacker than Blake's bike, so it's 68-degree head angle. So still really old school, really heavy. Rear suspension doesn't really work. The bike is in one piece, yes, so £350, it's good to go from the box. But again, this is another bike I'd say, would you want to ride downhill on this for very long? I wouldn't. It's going to do a job, but it's not going to do a job very well. Right, to the most expensive bike, the Devinci Wilson, £550, 2009-ish we think. It's definitely way more modern. You can tell from the components. You've got a RockShox boxer up front that was really good, direct mount stem. You've got the wide bars, actually the Stevie Smith bars that are too wide, I'd cut them down. But it's not completely original. So the front brake had that SRAM that was just a super floppy lever. We had to take that off. We swapped it for a super cheap Tektro, to be fair. Didn't have the cranks either, so it was missing a few parts when we bought this bike. So I've actually borrowed these Saints. So it's not exactly a £550 bike. We did, you know, theoretically spend more money on it. Obviously, we had the parts lying around, so you'd have to find a couple of bits to get this bike running. I've said that, it rode really well. I really enjoyed riding this bike. The big difference, I guess, between this and a modern downhill bike is the angles. So it is super short. We're trying to find the geometry chart for this. We couldn't, but we found the head angle is about 67 degrees, although it has got a 1.5 head tube, so there's a good chance you could get some angle set cups. That is going to reduce your reach a little bit if you make the bike slacker, and the reach is super short. So it's about 430mm reach on this bike. It's a medium, 26-inch wheels, of course. But what I would say is if you're in the market, if you're trying to find a cheap old downhill bike, I would look at sizing up. So I'm normally medium everything. I would look for a large bike because the old school frame size is just much smaller. If you can get one that isn't crazy standover, which you shouldn't be on a downhill bike, even if you run a completely slammed seat post, I think get a bigger bike than you'd normally ride. And I reckon the sizes will be okay. Obviously, the more modern you go, the more modern the angles are going to be, the better it's going to be. But obviously, then you're going to spend more money. So I would say this was about the cut-off point of bikes I would buy, about for this money. Like I said, all these bikes, all three of them, have had some pretty hard lives. So this bike is good, but all the bearings are shot on the back end. So it's super loose on the back. You can sort these bearings out. You could get some new ones, go to a bearing shop. There'll be codes on there. So you can fix that. Rear shock's in good condition, wheels are in good condition. I did run a spoke key over the front one, just so I had a couple of loose spokes, but for an old ratty downhill bike, it's really good, to be fair. So this bike was £39, decent components, brakes, gears all work. It's got an Alex Rims rear wheel, or rear rim, should I say. What hub is that? Daredevil rear hub, I wonder if that's the Devinci special. Mavic front rim. All in all, it's pretty good. You've even got a couple of different angles. You've got free ride or downhill mode. I guess the downhill mode slackens out a little bit. So all in all, pretty decent bike. After the day's riding, the only thing that let me down is the fork seal started leaking oil. So that is just a quick refresh on the fork. Not bad. What else? Like, it's been resprayed. That was kind of a warning sign before we bought it. You can see this was pretty good when I rode it, and the chain slap has just taken all that paint off. So it's had a pretty bad rattle can paint job. But the risk, I would say, with buying an old cheap downhill bike, especially off Facebook Marketplace, is trying to make sure it's not a stolen bike. And if it's been rattle canned, that's kind of one warning sign. So we did check as much as we could that this isn't stolen. But if you're missing a Devinci Wilson, you can have it back if you want. I'm finished with it. But other than that, like I said, it works pretty well. It's definitely not going to be as fast as a modern downhill bike. As we saw in the test, this bike with me on it was quite a lot faster than Rich and Blake on their bikes. It felt really good, it felt really fast. This would be a great bike park bike. Obviously 26-inch wheels are still the best for throwing around in the air. If you want a bike, you're going to do some laps, do some big jumps, uplift, this is still a really good option for not that much money. You just have to check them over, like I said, check bearings. They're not too expensive. If things like forks and wheels, drive trains, that kind of really check those out before you throw the money in. and maybe half expect that at some point you're gonna have to spend a couple £100 to freshen these bike up, find some different forks. Hopefully you can find some cheap secondhand, because obviously they are expensive, but there's a good chance you can get a good downhill bike for, I reckon, £600 or £700 all in. So there you go, let me know if you've got a downhill bike. I guess this is cool. If you want that N+1 bike, you don't want to spend a fortune, you just want a bike park, you know, semi-downhill racer bike in the garage for those fun days out, this is a great option. Let me know how cheap you got a downhill bike for, and if you fancy getting one for yourself. Give us a thumbs up if you love ragging cheap downhill bikes.